Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into a critical analysis of a really famous speech, Swami Vivekananda's 1893 address at the World Parliament of Religions, and we're going to be looking at it through the lens of our source for this explainer, Advanced Apologetics Research. Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll touch on why this speech is so celebrated. Then, we'll get into Vivekananda's main points. After that, we dive into the critique itself, looking at what the source calls factual errors, logical fallacies, and even cognitive biases. And we'll wrap it all up with the source's final conclusion. Let's get into it. All right, first up, a celebrated speech. You know, before we even get to the critique, it's super important to understand why this speech is such a big deal. It's not just some old document. For millions, especially for Indian Hindus, this was a massive moment of cultural pride on the global stage. Yeah, the source really emphasizes this point. For so many people, this speech isn't just a thing of the past. It's a source of real, everyday pride and inspiration. And you really have to get that deep emotional connection, because it explains why taking a critical look at it can be, well, pretty controversial. So let's get to the heart of it. What were Vivekananda's key points? What was the actual message he delivered back in 1893? The source we're looking at boils it down to a handful of core ideas, and these ideas are basically the foundation for the entire critique that follows. Okay, here are the big ones. The idea that religious truth is universal, that Hinduism is this incredibly tolerant and compassionate religion. And a really famous one, that all religions are just different rivers flowing into the same ocean, different paths to the same God. He was really pushing for unity, kind of challenging the idea that any one religion has the exclusive truth. He also talked a lot about service to humanity and put forward karma as the answer to why people suffer. So these are the pillars of his speech, and they're exactly what the critique is going to take on, one by one. All right, now we get into the critique itself. And the first stop is what the source calls factual errors. The basic question here is, do the claims Vivekananda made about history and his own faith actually line up with historical record? So let's tackle a huge one right out of the gate. Vivekananda famously painted this picture of Hinduism as being fundamentally tolerant, compassionate, a beacon of spiritual wisdom. But our source asks, is that really the case? The critique's answer is a pretty blunt no. And the main piece of evidence it points to is the caste system. The argument is that you can't really claim a religion is inherently tolerant when things like caste discriminations and atrocities, as the source puts it, are so deeply woven into the fabric of its society. It sees a major contradiction there. Okay, next question. Vivekananda was a proponent of a specific philosophy called Advaita, or non-dualism, and he presented it as pretty much the core of all Hindu thought. But the source pushes back and asks, hang on, is that the full story? And this really gets to a major theme in the analysis, which is this idea of oversimplification. The source claims that by presenting his own school of thought as the Hindu philosophy, Vivekananda was basically ignoring other major and even competing schools. What's more, it argues that historically there was a ton of bad blood, even persecution, between these different groups. And that, again, kind of complicates that picture of a perfectly unified, tolerant religion. Okay, here's another huge claim from the speech, one that's been incredibly influential over the years. This idea that Hinduism is the mother of all religions. And on this point, the source is really direct. It labels this a straight-up factual error. The argument is that there's just no historical evidence to back it up. It basically ignores the fact that other major world religions have their own unique, complex, and independent origins. Okay, so we've been talking about alleged factual errors. Now the critique kind of shifts gears. We're moving from the content of the claims to the structure of the arguments. In other words, we're looking at what the source calls logical fallacies. First up is something called the appeal to tradition. This is a classic one. It's basically the fallacy of saying something must be true or right just because it's really, really old. So how does this connect to the speech? The analysis claims that the speech uses the age of Hinduism as if it's proof of its truth or superiority. The argument, we're the oldest, therefore we're the best. The critique says, well, that's a fallacy. Just because something's ancient doesn't automatically make it true. Age isn't the same thing as evidence. All right, next on the list of logical fallacies is the false analogy. This happens when you try to prove a point by making a comparison, but the comparison itself doesn't really hold up. It's misleading or just plain superficial. And this is a really famous example from the speech. You've probably heard the analogy, as all rivers lead to the sea, all religions lead to God. It's a beautiful image, right? But the critique argues it's being presented not just as a nice metaphor, but as actual proof. And that's the problem. The source's point is pretty clear. A poetic analogy, no matter how powerful, is not the same thing as logical evidence.
Okay, so we've covered facts and logic. Now the analysis goes even deeper into the realm of psychology. The source suggests that certain cognitive biases, those little mental shortcuts our brains take all the time, might have played a role in both the speech itself and in how people have reacted to it over the years.
So you can see a few of them listed here, things like in-group bias, where you naturally favor your own group, or self-serving bias, where, for instance, you might frame karma as a superior answer to suffering because it reflects well on your own worldview. The source mentions a few, but there's one in particular that it really hones in on as being crucial to understanding the speech's legacy. And that's the authority bias. The argument here is that because Vivekananda is such a respected, revered authority figure, his words might get a pass. The source suggests that his status might have kind of shielded his arguments from the kind of tough questions and critical analysis they might have gotten from a less famous speaker. People are just more likely to believe him without questioning it.
So, after walking us through all these alleged errors in facts, in logic, and in psychology, what's the final takeaway? Where does the source's critique ultimately land? Let's get to the conclusion.
So the critique wraps it all up neatly into these 4 categories. It says there are factual errors, claims that don't match the historical record, logical errors, arguments that don't make sense, and cognitive errors, arguments that might be shaped by bias. Then it adds this 4th one, epistemological errors. That's a fancy word, but it just means errors in the way of knowing something. The source is basically saying the speech makes these huge, sweeping claims without offering any real solid way to prove they're true. And this brings us to the source's final verdict, which is very direct. It says, as Christians, as truth seekers, you should reject Vivekananda's speech because it is full of errors. So you can see it's framed as a call to action, specifically for its audience, arguing that if you're committed to finding truth, this speech, based on their analysis, just doesn't hold up. So we'll leave you with this final question to think about. How does digging into the structure of an argument, not just the message, but the logic, the analogies, the appeals to authority, how does that change how you see the message itself? It's an interesting thing to consider, isn't it?